I still remember the sound the rain made that afternoon. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady and tired, like it had been falling for longer than I could remember. It was early spring, the kind of day that refuses to commit to warmth or cold, leaving everything damp and gray and suspended between seasons. I was sitting by the kitchen window, watching the water streak down the glass in uneven lines, and I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. Or maybe I was thinking about everything at once, the way you do when you're alone too long with your own thoughts. On the counter beside me was a bouquet of wildflowers. Cheap ones, wrapped in crinkled brown paper that was already starting to curl at the edges. The colors, soft yellows, faded purples, a few stubborn whites, looked muted in the dim light, like they'd been drained of something essential. I hadn't bought them. They'd been sitting there since morning, and I hadn't moved them, hadn't put them in water, hadn't done anything but stare at them whenever I passed by. I told myself I didn't know why they unsettled me. But that wasn't true. The doorbell rang, and my chest tightened before I even stood up. I knew. Somehow, I knew who it was before I walked down the hall, before I turned the knob, before I saw him standing there on my porch with rain collecting in his hair and on his shoulders. Owen. 3 years. 3 years since I'd seen him, since I'd heard his voice, since we'd sat across from each other pretending we didn't feel what we felt. 3 years since the night we almost said the things we were too afraid to name. He looked older, not in a way that aged him, but in a way that suggested he'd lived through something heavy and come out quieter for it. His hair was shorter. His jacket was different. But his eyes, those hadn't changed. Still that same dark, careful gravity that used to undo me without warning, without permission. He held the bouquet awkwardly, stems dripping rainwater onto the wooden porch, and for a second neither of us moved. He said it had been a long time. His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Low, steady, careful. I nodded because I couldn't trust myself to speak yet. Because 3 years ago, on the last night I saw him, he'd looked at me across a room full of people and said I was just his best friend's brother. Nothing more. And I believed him. Or I tried to. I stood there in the doorway, and the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of things we'd never said, full of moments we'd let slip past, full of the weight of all that time apart. The rain kept falling behind him, blurring the trees and the street into soft shapes, and I could feel the cold air pressing into the warmth of the house. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, holding those flowers like an apology he didn't know how to voice. I wanted to close the door. I wanted to pull him inside. I wanted to ask him why now, why here, why me. But I didn't say any of it. Instead, I stepped aside. I let him in. And as he moved past me, the light shifted, just slightly, just enough, and I felt it again. That old ache. That unfinished thing that had been sitting inside me for 3 years, quietly waiting. The door closed behind him, and the sound of the rain became muted, distant. The air between us hummed with everything we weren't saying. I could smell the damp fabric of his jacket, the faint trace of something familiar I couldn't name. He set the flowers down on the entry table without a word, and I watched his hands. Those same hands that used to help my brother fix the fence, that used to pass me a beer on late summer nights, that once brushed mine while reaching for the same book and lingered half a second too long. He turned to face me, and I saw it in his expression, the same confusion, the same longing, the same fear I'd been carrying alone all this time. And I realized, standing there in my own hallway with the rain still streaking the windows and the flowers wilting on the counter, that nothing had ended 3 years ago. We just paused. And now, somehow, we were picking up exactly where we left off, at the edge of something we were both too afraid to fall into. My life, before Owen came back, had settled into something predictable. Safe, maybe, or at least manageable. I taught literature at the community college on the edge of town, mostly composition courses, sometimes a poetry elective that never quite filled. The students were fine. The work was fine. Everything was fine in that particular way that means nothing hurts, but nothing quite reaches you either. I lived in the house my parents left me when they moved south, a small 2-bedroom cottage backed up against the woods where the road turns to gravel. Mornings, I made coffee and graded essays at the kitchen table. Evenings, I made tea and read until the words blurred together. It was a measured life, a careful one. My brother Ethan visited often, more so since the baby came. He'd pull up in his truck with Sophie and little Maya, and the house would fill with the noise I'd grown used to living without. Laughter, crying, the particular chaos of new parenthood. Sophie would ask about my week while heating up bottles. Ethan would complain about work, about the garage needing new insulation, about how he hadn't slept in months. I'd hold Maya sometimes, her small weight warm against my chest, and feel both the tenderness of it and the distance. Their life felt like something happening on the other side of glass. Close enough to see clearly, too far to touch. We had dinner most Sundays. Ethan would grill if the weather allowed. Sophie made her mother's pasta when it didn't. We'd sit around the table my parents bought 30 years ago and talk about property taxes and local elections and whether the high school football team would make playoffs. The same polite laughter filled the gaps where deeper truths never quite reached. It was comfortable, familial, and I told myself it was enough. But 3 years ago, before the rhythm became routine, Owen was part of it. Owen was Ethan's best friend, had been since high school, the kind of friendship that doesn't need much maintenance because it's built on years of shared context. He came over on weekends to help with projects. He and Ethan rebuilt the deck one summer, tore down the old fence, and put up a new one the next. He stayed late drinking cheap beer on the porch after everyone else went to bed, talking about nothing and everything the way men do when they're too tired to perform. I watched him more than I should have. From the kitchen window while he and Ethan tossed a football across the yard, their movements easy and synchronized in that way athletes never quite lose. From the porch steps while they worked, his hands steady and capable, the muscles in his forearms tightening as he hammered or sawed or lifted. I told myself I was just observing, just present. But that wasn't true either. There were moments I still carry. Late nights by the fire pit when Ethan had gone inside and Owen stayed, nursing his last beer, talking about music or loneliness or the idea of leaving town someday. He asked me once what I loved about teaching, and I told him it was watching people learn to see themselves in stories they thought had nothing to do with them. He looked at me for a long time after I said that, the firelight making shadows on his face, and said he wished he'd had a teacher like me. The weight of his gaze felt like something I shouldn't acknowledge. So I didn't. Another time, we were in the garage looking for a socket wrench, and the space between us became too small, too warm. He reached past me for a toolbox, and his shoulder brushed mine, and neither of us moved for a beat longer than necessary. He smelled like sawdust and sweat, and something else I couldn't name. When he stepped back, he didn't look at me, just took the wrench and left. But I felt the echo of that moment for days. There was always something restrained between us, a recognition neither of us could name, or maybe neither of us wanted to. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd feel his presence shift when I entered a room, the way a compass needle turns toward north without deciding to. We never talked about it. We never acknowledged it. And then, suddenly, Owen left. He took a job in another city. Chicago, he said. Construction work, better pay, a chance to see something beyond the same streets we'd both grown up on. Ethan threw him a going-away party, burgers and too much beer, and everyone pretending it wasn't a big deal. Owen and I barely spoke that night. When he left, he shook my hand, said it was good knowing me. And that was it. No explanation. No goodbye that felt like it meant anything. Just silence, and then absence. I told myself it was nothing. He was just my brother's friend. Someone who came and went the way people do. But the house felt different after he left. Quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. And when Ethan mentioned him in passing over the months that followed, Owen got an apartment. Owen's working on a high-rise. Owen might come back for Christmas, but probably won't. I felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine. 3 years passed. The routine solidified. I stopped expecting him at Sunday dinners. I stopped thinking about the way his voice sounded when he laughed or the careful way he listened when I talked. I folded those moments into the part of my memory reserved for things that almost happened but didn't. And I convinced myself I'd moved on. Then he came back, with those flowers, with that same careful gravity in his eyes. And the moment I saw him standing on my porch, I knew nothing had faded. It had just been waiting. The flowers he brought that first day were still on the counter, wilting slowly in the gray light, their colors bleeding into brown at the edges. I hadn't thrown them away. I hadn't put them in water. I just let them sit there, dying quietly, like everything we'd never said. Owen's return wasn't casual, though he tried to make it seem that way. When I asked him why he was back, standing there in my hallway with rain still dripping from his jacket, he said he'd come to visit Ethan, to see how things were, to catch up. But his eyes moved toward me as he said it, just for a second, and I knew there was more he wasn't saying. I didn't push. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He'd been living in Chicago for 3 years, he told me. Working construction, mostly commercial projects, office buildings, high-rises, the kind of work that pays well but wears you down. He'd moved apartments twice, lived with roommates he barely knew, spent weekends driving to places he'd forget by Monday. There was something in the way he described it that felt untethered, like he'd been looking for something he couldn't find or running from something he couldn't name. He seemed quieter now than I remembered. Steadier, maybe. But there was regret in his voice when he talked about the last 3 years, a weight that hadn't been there before. I made tea because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. We sat at the kitchen table, the one my parents used to sit at, and the silence between us felt both familiar and unbearable. He asked about my teaching. I told him it was the same. He asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no, too quickly, and regretted the transparency of it. He nodded, looked down at his cup, and didn't offer anything about his own life in return. The conversation moved in circles, never quite landing anywhere real. When he left that first day, he thanked me for the tea, said he'd see me around, and walked back out into the rain. I watched him go from the window, and the feeling that settled over me afterward was something close to grief. Ethan called that night, said Owen had reached out a few weeks ago, mentioned he was thinking about coming back to visit, maybe stay a while. Ethan was excited, said it would be like old times, that we should all get together, have a barbecue, make a weekend of it. I told him that sounded fine, even though my stomach tightened at the thought. Ethan said Owen seemed different. Older, more serious. I agreed and didn't say that I'd noticed the same thing, that I'd spent the last 3 hours thinking about nothing else. The barbecue happened the following Saturday. Ethan and Sophie's backyard, the same yard where Owen and Ethan used to toss the football, where we'd spent dozens of summer evenings pretending everything was simple. Sophie had strung lights across the patio. Ethan manned the grill with the focused intensity he brought to anything involving fire and meat. A few of their friends came, people I recognized but didn't know well, neighbors with kids who ran around shrieking in that joyful, chaotic way children do. Owen moved through it all like someone half remembered, present but not quite there. I stayed near the edge of things, holding a beer I wasn't drinking, watching him when I thought no one would notice. The atmosphere was tense in its familiarity. Everyone kept saying how good it was to have Owen back, how much they'd missed him, how nothing had really changed. But everything had changed. I could feel it in the way he avoided looking at me directly, in the careful distance he maintained even when we ended up near each other. It was like we were both trying not to disturb something fragile, some unspoken agreement that if we didn't acknowledge what was between us, we could pretend it wasn't there. As the sun started to set, the crowd thinned. Kids were loaded into cars, tired and sticky with barbecue sauce. Sophie took Maya inside for a bath. Ethan stayed by the grill, scraping down the grates and drinking his 4th or 5th beer. I walked toward the back fence, the one Owen and Ethan had built together years ago, because I needed air and space and a moment away from the weight of performing normalcy. I didn't hear him approach. I just felt his presence beside me, the way I always had. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, hands in his pockets, looking out at the darkening yard. Then he said he'd been thinking about me, that something about this town, about being back here, had never really left him alone. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, like he was confessing something he shouldn't. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand honesty after 3 years of silence, but instead I deflected, said it was good to see him, said I was sure Ethan was glad he was back. All the polite, meaningless things you say when you're too afraid to say what's real. Owen smiled faintly, that same smile he used to give me when he was trying not to say too much, when he was holding something back. He said he should probably go, that it was getting late. I nodded, and he walked away. I stayed by the fence for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of Ethan cleaning up, Sophie singing softly to Maya through the open window, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. The lights Sophie had strung up swayed gently in the breeze, casting uneven shadows across the grass. I felt hollowed out, like something had been confirmed that I'd been trying to deny. Later that night, long after I'd gone home and showered and tried to convince myself to stop thinking about him, there was a knock at my door. It was almost 11. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, no one was there. Just a book sitting on the doormat, wrapped in the same kind of crinkled brown paper the flowers had come in. I brought it inside and unwrapped it carefully. Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. An old paperback edition, the kind you find in used bookstores, pages yellowed and spine creased from being read too many times. Tucked inside the front cover was a note, handwritten on a torn piece of notebook paper. It said, "For the one who always understood without words." No signature, but I knew his handwriting. I'd seen it on grocery lists left on Ethan's counter, on measurements penciled onto 2x4s, on the birthday card he'd given me once that just said, "Happy birthday, Caleb," and nothing else. I sat down on the couch and held the book in my hands for a long time. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a declaration. But it was a beginning. An acknowledgement of something we'd both been too afraid to name. I opened it to a random page and read a passage about solitude and longing and the difficulty of truly being seen. And I realized Owen hadn't just come back to visit. He was seeking something he'd left unfinished. Something we'd both left unfinished. The flowers on the counter had turned completely brown by then, petals curling inward, stems brittle and dry. I still hadn't thrown them away. After the book arrived, something shifted. I started seeing Owen more often, though neither of us acknowledged the pattern. There were always excuses, thin, transparent ones that we both pretended to believe. Ethan needed help replacing the rotted boards on his deck. Owen stopped by the college campus to drop off something for Ethan and happened to catch me between classes. He left a message on my phone asking if I knew where Ethan kept his spare drill bits, even though he could have just called Ethan directly. Each meeting felt like walking a tightrope between longing and restraint, between what we wanted and what we thought we were allowed to have. I'd find myself checking my phone more than I should, hoping for another message. I'd take the long way home from work, past the coffee shop where I knew he sometimes sat in the afternoons, laptop open, pretending to look for jobs, but mostly just staring out the window. Once, I saw him there and almost kept walking. But he looked up at exactly the wrong moment, caught my eye through the glass, and waved me in. I sat across from him for an hour, drinking coffee that went cold while we talked about nothing important. The weather, an article he'd read, a movie he thought I'd like. But underneath the casual conversation, there was a current, a pull, the kind of tension that made every accidental touch feel deliberate, every pause feel weighted with things we weren't saying. Our conversations began to deepen in ways they hadn't before, or maybe in ways we'd never allowed them to. He told me about Chicago, about the loneliness of living in a city where everything moves fast, but nothing quite touches you. About the roommate who played guitar at 2 in the morning, about the job site where a man fell from scaffolding and Owen had nightmares about it for weeks. About how he'd tried dating a few times, but it never went anywhere, because he was always somewhere else in his head. He didn't say where. He didn't have to. I told him things I hadn't told anyone. About the student who wrote an essay about coming out to her parents and how I'd cried reading it in my office, door closed, blinds drawn. About the way teaching sometimes felt like performing, like standing in front of a room full of people and pretending you have answers when you're just as lost as they are. About the nights when the house felt too quiet, when I'd sit at the kitchen table with a book I wasn't reading and wonder if this was all there was. He listened the way he always had, fully, carefully, like every word mattered. Like I mattered. One evening, Ethan called and asked if I could help him fix a shelf in Maya's room that had come loose from the wall. Owen was already there when I arrived, toolbox open on the floor, measuring tape in hand. Ethan had been called into work. An emergency at the garage, something about a truck that wouldn't start, and a customer who needed it by morning. He apologized, said he'd be back in an hour, told us to go ahead without him. Then he was gone, and it was just the two of us in the small nursery with its pale yellow walls and the faint smell of baby powder. We worked in near silence at first. Owen held the shelf level while I marked where the new brackets should go. I drilled pilot holes while he sorted through screws, finding the right size, handing them to me one at a time. It was the kind of easy, unspoken coordination that comes from familiarity, from knowing how someone moves and thinks without needing instruction. At one point, we both reached for the same nail, our hands colliding in the toolbox. His fingers brushed mine. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch lasted a beat too long, maybe two, and when I finally withdrew my hand, I could feel the heat of it lingering on my skin. He cleared his throat, said something about the weather supposed to clear up by the weekend. I agreed, even though I hadn't checked the forecast in days. We finished the shelf without incident, packed up the tools, stood there in the quiet room with its cheerful mobile turning slowly above the crib. He asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime. Not at Ethan's, just the two of us. His voice was steady when he said it, but I saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear of rejection. I said yes before I could think better of it. He smiled, a real smile, not the careful, guarded ones he usually offered, and something in my chest loosened. We didn't wait for the weekend. We went 2 nights later to a small Italian place on the edge of town, the kind with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles, and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. It wasn't a date. We didn't call it that, but it felt like one. We sat across from each other in a corner booth, the restaurant half empty on a weeknight, and talked until our food went cold. He told me about the first time he realized he wasn't like other guys, sitting in his high school locker room, and understanding that what he felt when he looked at his teammates wasn't the same thing they felt. About the years of pushing it down, of convincing himself it wasn't real, of choosing safety over honesty. I told him I understood, that I'd spent most of my 20s doing the same thing, that sometimes I still did. At night, after these meetings, I'd go home and read the Rilke book again. I'd gotten through it once already, but I kept returning to certain passages, the ones about solitude and longing and the necessity of sitting with difficult truths. One evening, I found another note tucked between the pages near the end of the book. I don't know how I'd missed it the first time. It was folded small, hidden in the gutter between pages. The handwriting was the same, but the ink looked older, like it had been written long before he gave me the book. It said, "What is necessary, after all, is this, solitude, vast inner solitude." And then, in smaller letters beneath, "I've been alone for so long. I don't know how to stop." I read it 3 times, sitting on my couch in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I understood what he was trying to say, that he'd been carrying this alone, that he'd come back not just to visit, but because he couldn't stay away anymore, that whatever was between us, this unnamed, unspoken thing, had followed him to Chicago and back again, had waited 3 years to resurface, had been building towards something inevitable. The tension grew in small gestures. A brush of shoulders when we passed each other in Ethan's kitchen, his hand on the small of my back, just for a second, guiding me through a doorway. The way his eyes would find mine across a room and hold for a moment too long before looking away. Shared glances that felt like apologies, like promises, like questions neither of us knew how to ask. Every mundane moment, passing him a screwdriver, sitting beside him on Ethan's porch, hearing his voice on the phone, became charged with meaning. I knew it couldn't last. This careful dance we were doing, this pretending we could be just friends, just 2 people spending time together without consequence. Something was building. I could feel it in the tightness in my chest when I saw him, in the way I started making excuses to be wherever he was, in the dreams I'd wake from in the middle of the night, heart racing, his name on my lips. We were moving towards something, and I didn't know if I was more afraid of it happening or not happening. The book sat on my nightstand now, the notes marking places I returned to when I couldn't sleep. The flowers from that first day were long dead, brittle and brown on the kitchen counter, but I still hadn't thrown them away. They'd become a kind of monument to everything unfinished, everything we were too afraid to complete. And somewhere beneath all the fear and caution and careful restraint, I knew we were running out of time to decide what we wanted this to be. It happened on an evening when none of us expected it. The power had gone out during a storm, one of those sudden spring tempests that rolls in fast and violent, turning the sky green before it opens up. I was at home grading papers by lamplight when Ethan called, said they'd lost power too, asked if I could come over and help him get the generator running before the freezer thawed. Owen was already there, had been helping Ethan in the garage when the lights went out. I should have said no, should have made some excuse. But I didn't. By the time I arrived, the rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that soaks you through in seconds. Ethan met me at the door with a flashlight, water dripping from his hair, frustration written across his face. The generator was being stubborn. He'd been trying to get it started for 20 minutes. Owen was still in the garage, he said, taking another look at it. Sophie and Maya were upstairs, Sophie singing softly to keep the baby calm in the dark. I told Ethan I'd see what I could do. The garage smelled like oil and wet concrete. Owen was crouched beside the generator, flashlight propped against a toolbox, hands working methodically through the troubleshooting steps. He looked up when I came in, and something passed between us, recognition, maybe, or resignation. Like we both knew this night was going to be different somehow. I knelt beside him, and we worked together in the dim, flickering light, our voices low beneath the drumming of rain on the metal roof. It took another 15 minutes, but we got it running. The generator coughed to life with a shudder, and a moment later the house lights came back on, visible through the door Ethan had left open. He appeared in the doorway, relieved and grateful, said we were lifesavers. Then his phone rang. The garage again. The emergency from earlier in the week had turned into something bigger, and he was apologizing, saying he had to go, that Sophie would make us coffee, that he'd be back as soon as he could. He grabbed his keys and disappeared into the rain before either of us could respond. Owen and I stood there in the garage, the generator humming beside us, and the silence felt different than it had before. Heavier, more deliberate. He said we should probably go inside. I agreed. We walked through the rain to the back door, neither of us hurrying, letting the water soak through our clothes. Inside, Sophie was coming down the stairs, Maya finally asleep in her arms. She thanked us, said she was going to lie down with the baby for a bit, make sure she stayed settled. Then she was gone too, and it was just the two of us standing in the kitchen with water pooling at our feet. The power flickered once, twice, then went out again. The generator had bought us maybe 20 minutes. Owen swore softly. I found candles in the drawer by the sink. Sophie kept them for exactly this kind of thing, and lit 3 of them, placing them on the counter. The warm, unsteady light made the kitchen feel smaller, more intimate. Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. Thunder rolled low and constant, and the rain kept coming, relentless against the windows. I was standing by the window, watching the water stream down the glass in the candlelight, when I said it. I didn't plan to. The words just came out, quiet and tired and true. I told him he shouldn't have come back, that these past few weeks had been harder than the 3 years he'd been gone, that I didn't know what he wanted from me, but whatever it was, I wasn't sure I could give it. He didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing behind me, could feel the weight of his presence in the small kitchen. Then he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the rain, that he didn't have a choice, that he'd tried to stay away, that he'd spent 3 years trying to convince himself that what he felt wasn't real, that it would fade with time and distance. But it hadn't. It had only gotten worse. I turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, candlelight catching the water still dripping from his hair, his shirt clinging to his shoulders. His eyes were steady on mine, and for the first time since he'd come back, he wasn't hiding, wasn't pretending. He looked at me the way he used to 3 years ago, in those brief, unguarded moments when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like I was something he wanted and feared in equal measure. The silence that followed felt sacred. The air smelled like rain and candle wax and something electric I couldn't name. Neither of us moved. The space between us felt both vast and non-existent. like we were standing on opposite sides of a line we'd drawn years ago and never crossed. I wanted to say something. Wanted to ask him what happens now, what this means, what we're supposed to do with this truth we've finally spoken aloud. But I couldn't find the words. He took a step toward me. Slowly, carefully, like he was approaching something fragile that might break if he moved too fast. Then another step, and another, until he was close enough that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear and hope fighting for space. He lifted his hand, slowly, almost reverently, and let his fingers graze my cheek, barely touching, just the whisper of contact. His hand was cold from the rain. Mine was trembling. For a moment, we just stood there, his hand against my face, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat, the candlelight making shadows dance across the walls. Then he leaned in, and I didn't stop him, didn't pull away, didn't do any of the careful, cautious things I'd been doing for weeks. I let him close the distance between us. The kiss was not what I expected. It wasn't cinematic or dramatic or certain. It was hesitant, trembling, like neither of us quite remembered how to do this. Like we were learning something new and ancient at the same time. His lips were soft and unsure against mine, and I could feel the question in it. Is this okay? Is this real? Are we really doing this? I answered by kissing him back, by letting my hand find the back of his neck, by allowing myself, for the first time in 3 years, to stop pretending I didn't want this. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, maybe less. Then the lights came back on, sudden and bright and jarring, and we pulled apart like the world had caught us. The spell broke. Reality crashed back in. We stood there in the too-bright kitchen, breathing hard, staring at each other with something between wonder and panic. From upstairs, I heard Sophie's footsteps, heard her moving around now that the power had returned. Owen stepped back, then back again, put distance between us like he could undo what had just happened. His face was unreadable, fear, regret, longing, all of it tangled together. I heard Ethan's truck pulling into the driveway, the sound of his door slamming, his voice calling out that he was home. Owen looked toward the front door, then back at me, and I saw in his eyes that he understood what I understood, that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross, that everything had changed, that we were standing in my brother's kitchen, and my brother was about to walk through that door, and we had no idea what we were going to do with this truth we'd finally let surface. The rain kept falling outside. The candles still burned on the counter, useless now in the electric light. And between us hung everything we'd said and done, waiting to be dealt with. The days after the storm passed in a kind of quiet agony. Owen kept his distance, and I didn't reach out. We moved around each other like ghosts, present in the same spaces, but carefully avoiding contact. When Ethan invited me over for dinner that weekend, Owen was conspicuously absent. Ethan mentioned he'd been busy, something about looking at apartments, maybe heading back to Chicago sooner than planned. He said it casually, like it didn't matter, but I felt the words land in my chest like stones. I stopped going to the coffee shop where I used to see him, stopped checking my phone every few minutes, stopped letting myself hope for a message that never came. The silence between us was different now, not the uncertain quiet of before, but something final. Something that felt like an ending before we'd ever really begun. I told myself it was better this way. Safer. That what happened in the kitchen was a mistake, a moment of weakness we were both smart enough to walk away from. But I didn't believe it, and the not believing made everything worse. Guilt became my constant companion. It sat with me in the morning when I made coffee, rode beside me on the drive to work, settled across from me at the dinner table. I'd see Ethan's name on my phone and feel it tighten around my ribs. He'd call to ask about weekend plans or to tell me something funny Maya had done, and I'd respond with the right words in the right tone while feeling like a liar, like I was betraying him with every breath I didn't use to confess. He noticed something was off, asked once if I was feeling okay, if work was getting to me, and I told him I was fine, just tired. He believed me because he had no reason not to. I started avoiding family dinners, made excuses that sounded plausible, papers to grade, a cold I couldn't shake, a faculty meeting that ran late. Sophie called once to check on me, said she missed seeing me, that Maya was asking where Uncle Caleb was. The sweetness of her concern made the guilt worse. These were good people, my family, and I was lying to them, hiding something that would hurt them if they knew. I told myself I was protecting them, but really, I was protecting myself. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The routine I'd built before Owen returned started to reassemble itself. Teaching, grading, the quiet evenings alone with books I didn't retain. But it felt hollow now, like I was going through motions I no longer believed in. The house felt emptier than it had before. The silence was louder. I'd catch myself staring out the kitchen window at nothing, remembering the weight of his hand on my cheek, the hesitation in that kiss, the way the candlelight had made shadows on the walls. And I'd have to force myself back to the present, back to the life where those things hadn't happened or didn't matter. Then one evening, just as the light was fading and I was settling in with tea and another stack of essays I had no energy to read, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I knew who it was before I reached the door. Owen, standing in the same spot he'd stood weeks ago with those flowers. But this time his hands were empty. This time he looked like someone who'd run out of excuses. He said he was leaving in the morning, going back to Chicago. He'd already told Ethan, already packed his things. He said it quickly, like he'd rehearsed it, like he needed to get the words out before he lost his nerve. I stood in the doorway and didn't invite him in. Didn't say anything. Just waited for whatever came next. He looked at me with something close to desperation. Said if he stayed, he'd ruin everything. That Ethan was his best friend, that this was Ethan's family, that he couldn't be the person who destroyed that. That every day he stayed made it harder to do the right thing. His voice cracked on the last part, just slightly, and I saw how much it was costing him to walk away. But he was going to do it anyway, because walking away was easier than staying and facing what it meant. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could figure this out, that love, if that's what this was, didn't have to be destructive. But the words wouldn't come, because part of me agreed with him. Part of me had been thinking the same thing for weeks, that we were standing on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to cross, and trying would only hurt the people we cared about. So I said nothing, just looked at him with eyes that had finally stopped pretending not to care. He said he'd been thinking about that night in the kitchen every day since, that he'd tried to convince himself it was a mistake, that they could go back to being just friends, just two people who used to know each other. But he couldn't, because it wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing he'd done in 3 years, maybe in his whole life, and that terrified him more than anything. He told me he'd been alone for so long that he didn't know how to be anything else, that even wanting this, wanting me, felt like trespassing on a life he didn't have permission to enter, that he kept thinking about Ethan's face if he ever found out, about the betrayal, about how it would break something that couldn't be repaired. And no matter how much he wanted to stay, he couldn't live with that. So he was leaving. And this time, he wasn't coming back. The evening air was cool against my skin. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. A car drove past, headlights sweeping across us for a moment before disappearing. Normal sounds. Normal life continuing around us while everything inside me was breaking. I wanted to reach for him. Wanted to pull him inside and tell him we'd figure it out together. But I didn't, because he was right. If he stayed, something would break. And I wasn't sure either of us was strong enough to handle the aftermath. He said if he went, he'd regret it forever. Said it quietly, like a confession he'd been carrying alone. Then he looked at me one last time. Really looked at me, the way he had in the candlelight, without pretense or protection, and I saw everything he wasn't saying. The longing, the fear, the resignation, the love he couldn't quite name but couldn't deny either. And I understood that this was his choice, that he'd already made it, that he'd come here not to be convinced to stay, but to say goodbye properly, to give us both a chance at closure we hadn't had 3 years ago. I didn't tell him not to go, didn't beg him to stay. I just stood there in my doorway, watching him the way I'd watched him leave 3 years before, and let him make the choice he needed to make. He nodded once, a small gesture that felt like an acknowledgement of everything we'd never said and never would. Then he turned and walked down the steps, down the path, back to his car parked on the street. I watched until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I closed the door and stood in my hallway in the growing dark, listening to the silence settle back around me. The house felt colder than it had before, emptier in a way that I knew, even then, would never quite heal. On the entry table, the book was still there, Rilke, with its notes hidden between pages. I picked it up and held it for a long time. Then I carried it into my bedroom and set it in a box along with my brother's old varsity jacket, the one Owen used to borrow on cold nights when they'd work late on the porch. I folded the jacket carefully, smoothing out the creases, and placed the book on top. The flowers from that first day had long since turned to dust. I'd finally thrown them away days ago, but their absence still marked the spot on the counter where they'd been, where everything had started, and now, where everything was ending. 3 years passed again, the same length of time as the first absence, but different somehow. Heavier, more permanent. The town didn't change much. Same streets, same faces, same rhythm of seasons turning over themselves. But I changed. Something in me had shifted, settled into a different shape. I still taught at the community college, still lived alone in the house by the woods, still graded essays at the kitchen table and made tea in the evenings. But the weight I'd been carrying, the guilt, the longing, the sense of something unfinished, had transformed into something quieter. Not gone, just integrated. A scar instead of an open wound. I started going to family dinners again. Ethan never asked why I'd stopped, and I never told him. We fell back into our old patterns, Sunday meals, birthday gatherings, the easy rhythm of siblings who've known each other their whole lives. Maya was older now, talking in full sentences, asking questions about everything. Sophie was pregnant again. Life continued its forward motion, and I moved with it, no longer fighting the current. Owen's name came up sometimes. Ethan would mention him in passing. Owen got promoted. Owen was seeing someone. Owen moved to a different neighborhood. I'd nod and make appropriate responses and feel the echo of something that used to hurt, but didn't quite anymore. Or maybe it did, but I'd learned to live with it. The way you learn to live with any loss. By carrying it until it becomes part of you. I dated, briefly, a man I met at a faculty mixer, kind and intelligent and interested. We went to dinner 3 times. He kissed me goodnight after the 3rd date, and I felt nothing. Not because of him. He was perfectly fine. But because some part of me was still standing in that candlelit kitchen, still feeling the trembling hesitation of a kiss that had meant too much to ever really move past. I told him I wasn't ready. He understood. We stayed friendly, the way people do when they both know it's not going to work. The box with the book and the jacket stayed in my closet, untouched. I didn't open it. Didn't need to. I remembered what was inside. Then one afternoon in early spring, the same season, the same quality of light, the mail came with a letter postmarked from Chicago. My name and address written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I stood by the mailbox for a long time, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, just present, real. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table while I made tea. Gave myself time to decide whether to open it, but I already knew I would. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The photo showed a construction crew, 5 or 6 men in hard hats and work clothes, standing in front of a half-finished building, squinting into sunlight. Owen was in the corner, slightly apart from the others, holding a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand. The same kind he'd brought that rainy day 3 years ago. His expression was unreadable, not quite smiling, not quite serious, just present. The note was brief, written on the same kind of torn notebook paper as before. It said, "Still building. Still thinking of you." I read it twice, then a 3rd time. The words didn't change, but their weight shifted with each reading. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't suggesting anything, just letting me know he was still out there, still carrying the same thing I was. That whatever we'd had, whatever we'd almost had, hadn't faded for him either. And somehow that was enough. Not everything, but enough. I placed the photo inside the Rilke book, where the first note used to be. The book had stayed in the box all this time, waiting. I took it out now, brushed off the dust, opened it to the page where I'd found his words about solitude and loneliness. The ink had faded slightly, but the meaning hadn't. I slipped the photo between those pages and closed the book gently. Then I carried it to the kitchen windowsill, the same window where I'd sat 3 years ago watching rain streak the glass like tired veins. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and gray, the kind that promised rain. I could smell it in the air, that particular scent of approaching weather, earth and ozone, and something indefinable. On the table beside me, there was a new bouquet of wildflowers. I'd bought them myself that morning at the farmer's market, on impulse, without thinking too hard about why. Fresh ones, unwrapped, colors bright against the wood. Yellow and purple and white. The same colors as before. I didn't cry, didn't smile, didn't do anything dramatic or final. I just stood there by the window, holding my tea, watching the first drops of rain begin to fall. Soft at first, then steadier. The world outside blurred and shimmered behind the water on the glass, familiar and distant at once. And I thought about Owen in Chicago, standing in front of some building with flowers in his hand. About the photograph he'd chosen to send. About the fact that after 3 more years, he still thought of me. Still carried what we'd had. I thought about love and how it doesn't always look like the stories promise. How sometimes it's just two people who found each other at the wrong time, in the wrong circumstances, and had to let go not because they wanted to, but because staying would have broken something irreparable. How that doesn't make it less real. Just different. Quieter. A thing you carry rather than a thing you hold. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the roof, running down the windows in uneven streams. The flowers on the table were fresh and alive, waiting for nothing, promising nothing. Just there. Present. Real. And somewhere in Chicago, Owen was still building. Still thinking. Still carrying the same weight I was. We'd never have what we almost had. But we'd always have what we did have. That moment in the candlelight, that trembling kiss, that brief window where we'd been honest enough to stop pretending. And maybe that was its own kind of enough. I set my tea down and watched the rain. The same rain that had been falling 3 years ago. The same rain that would fall 3 years from now. Constant. Patient. Returning. Always returning.